Hello, I'm Seema Rao, Deputy Director and Chief Experience Officer of the Akron Art Museum. I'm here to share some ideas about Reconsidered, new works from our collection. The show will be shown in two rotations. The first rotation closes June 2nd, and let me share with you three works from that show that were made by regional artists. The first work is called 2 Weeks with Pay by Elmer Novotny from 1957. This is a wonderful work made in casein paint. Casein paint is when you take pigment, when you add it to milk. You might know of tempera paint. We sometimes buy tempera paint in the store, and that's actually not what we call traditional tempera paint. Traditional tempera paint was made with egg. That's one way to make paint. Oil paint is pigment plus oil, and then casein is pigment plus milk. The thing that I love about the effect of casein paint is that it has a fairly matte surface, but it can be done in a way that looks incredibly finished. And if you looked at the surface of 2 Weeks with Pay, you would see that it is so smooth. You can't see a human hand, a brush stroke, or anything. It is so beautifully done. The other thing about this painting is that it's clearly done by somebody who has an incredible finesse with representation. Elmer Novotny was a professor at Kent State, and he might be best known for his portraits. We have a number in our collection. And this one is not a portrait. There's not a person there. But in a way, you can see that somebody has been there or will come into the space. We have these vacation huts, perhaps, or swimming huts, and each of them has a name. Each of the names is a flower, like hyacinth and phlox. And then you can see that one of them has an orange screen. And so you get the sense of humanity in this space, even though it's devoid of people. Another thing I really love about this painting is how it's composed. It is really interestingly horizontal. You see the horizontal lines of the slats. You see the horizontal line in the screen. You see the horizontal line of the sky against the water and the horizontal line of the beach. It is really a kind of controlled composition. And yet, all of that order allows your eye to keep going in between the different elements, and you want to keep looking. It's just, if there's something truly compelling about looking at this composition. Another work I'd like to introduce you to is Mary Ellen McDermott's 1953 Man is the Measure of All Things. And it is oil on fiberboard. So it's a different composition. We talked about paint with Elmer Novotny's work. In this case, the pigment has been added to oil. Now, she might have used commercial oils. Historically, artists used something like linseed oil, and then by the 20th century, artists were purchasing oils, and they would be purchasing oil paint, perhaps in a tube. Tube paints came in the late 19th century. Now, Mary Ellen McDermott was a teacher at the Akron Art Institute. She had studied at the Cleveland Institute of Art, and then she came back to her hometown in Akron and taught at the Art Institute, eventually to go back and teach at the Cleveland Institute of Art. She taught enamels. One thing that's really wonderful about this painting is you can see both of her media, both painting and enamel, I think, in the way that it's composed. Enamel is an interesting process in that it is basically like working with glass, powdered glass that you heat, and it adheres to a metal plate. And one thing that you can imagine, it's sort of, if you've ever worked with candied sugar, for example, and sugar cookies, when you melt them, they sort of go where they want to go. And one thing I love about this painting is it has spots in the back that you can tell almost have this sort of surprise quality. They almost have this sort of firework effect in the background, sort of throughout. And I love that sort of spontaneity that you see in the scene. That is in juxtaposition with a lot of the structure that she put into it. What we have is you have a scale, and on the scales are even, they're equal, I guess, in weight. On one side, you have 4 figures, and each of the figures seems like they might be ethnically or racially different. And then on the other side, you have things like a beaker, a microscope, a quill. And so what you have is basically the weighing of humanity against the humanities in this case, in the arts and sciences perhaps. But in the 1950s in America and in the world, lots of things were changing. In the 1950s, you get the rise and the IBM comes into founding. The structure of DNA has been published. The world is changing quite considerably and quite quickly. And so here we have a painter in Akron who's creating this work that seems like it might resonate with those issues. There's a lot of other elements to this painting as well that are quite interesting. Like, for example, the artist, this surface is also very smooth. However, there's also elements of it that are scratched into the surface. So you will see that there's a small fish, for example, that's been scratched into the surface. And there's other sort of scratched elements that are, it's called sgraffito, where you scratch into the surface of the painting. And then finally, there's some other parts that are just sort of interesting. Like in the far top right, you'll see that there are volcanoes, and it makes you wonder what's happening. There's also some math formulas that we don't know what those math formulas are. We'd love to hear if you happen to know what the math formulas are. But overall, you know, it sort of has this really interesting, complicated iconography. The final element of the iconography that really surprises people is, so if you see the scales in the front, and then I describe the background with the sort of, you know, firework-like elements and the sgraffito and the volcanoes in between those two elements in the middle ground, perhaps, there is a figure that she has not written about this work, so we don't know what it is, but it perhaps is an image of God. It could be something else. I'd love to hear anybody else's inspiration or interpretation of what this is, but it's a very interesting painting. We've seen that many visitors walk in and they're truly surprised. It does not look like anything else that we have in the galleries. So the third work I'd love to describe is something that's quite different than the first two. So if the first one is very representational, and the second one, while representational, has an interesting iconography, the third work by a regional artist that I'd like to showcase is Francis Joseph Myers' The Garden from 1960. This work, Francis Joseph Myers was a professor at Cleveland Institute of Art. He taught drawing, amongst other things. This work is not very representational. It does have a representational name, A Garden, but it is a bright red, and it is so vibrant. It is lovely digitally, as you see it here, but it is even more lovely in real life. It just sort of commands a room, this beautiful, bright, vibrant red. And then in amongst that vibrant red, you'll see the weaving of many little patches of other colors, like small elements of various greens and various blues. But to me, what really strikes me is the way the line is described. So you can see that there's these strong strokes that go down and then additional strokes that go across. And it almost has an architectural feel to it. And it is from 1960. And to me, it really evokes some of the most beautiful architecture of the 1960s, and also textile design of the era. So you have all of these beautiful elements that are within it that create this very harmonious composition. And overall, it is just a wonderful painting to be around, to see in real life. And it's one that I would really encourage you to come and see. There's many, many more works to see in Reconsidered. Those are just 3 that we wanted to feature today. And as I said, this first rotation closes on June 6th.